Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started with a talk from Claire Harris, and so I'll let her take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm here from the University of Glasgow. Thanks for that little applause. I am here to talk to you today about my PhD research and how I've tried to incorporate Julia into that. So just briefly, I'm going to talk about our motivations behind wanting to simulate biodiversity on such a large scale, a bit about who we are and who makes up our team and how we've started to approach this problem, particularly where Julia is concerned, and then talk a little bit about my experience coming into Julia from kind of a primarily non-computational background and only really working in R before that. Okay. So to start us off, if we hear things about biodiversity loss or conservation, we most often see images like this of fairly charismatic species. But what should be known is that we're seeing loss at kind of every level of life, from animals to plants, from marine environments to terrestrial. So much so that we're worried we're entering the age of the sixth mass extinction, which would be the first since the dinosaurs were wiped out. So rather than wanting to kind of cross a line that we can't come back from in terms of our biodiversity loss, the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, spent a while setting up a strategic plan to run from 2011 to 2020 with a view towards halting this crisis. So as you can see, our time is almost up on that plan, but we're not really sure if the situation has changed, whether it's improved or got worse. So part of the problem is that although there were lots of targets set up called the Aichi targets, and you can check them out at that link if you'd like to have a look at them, and they're kind of looking at biodiversity from various different angles, things like agriculture and habitat loss and genetic diversity. But we really need a lot of data to be able to look at this globally, which is becoming increasingly available. But then when we have the data, we need to really be able to strongly quantify exactly what's going on. So let me be the first to say that measuring biodiversity is not easy, and I have kind of a quite simple example of some of the problems involved. So if you were to go into a habitat and want to count up the biodiversity that's there, the first thing that you might do is just to count the number of species. So if you went into an ecosystem like this and found 70,000 species of ant, you might go, woohoo, you know, great, that's really diverse, I can set my protected area flag up here. But actually what you might be ignoring is systems surrounding that have a broader variety of different animals and plants, and you're ignoring the fact that the species in this system are all very similar. So the idea of similarity is something that we want to incorporate into any measures of biodiversity to let us robustly compare between different ecosystems and different ways of looking at biodiversity. And traditionally in ecology, we split biodiversity up into three concepts, so that would be alpha, beta, and gamma diversity. And I'll go through a bit what I mean by those now. So my colleagues at the University of Glasgow have come up with a really clever method for looking at alpha, beta, and gamma on kind of a smaller scale. So what we can do is we can look at individual habitats in a whole system, like the Earth, and look at what their alpha diversity is, or the local diversity of that patch, look at their beta diversity, or how distinct that patch is, so how different it is from the surrounding areas, and then get a kind of combined idea of those two things, diversity and distinctiveness, to get an idea of what contribution that patch is giving overall. So we can really decompose biodiversity into kind of different angles of looking at it. So that's quite nice. So I mentioned that we're a team from the University of Glasgow, predominantly mathematicians and ecologists, all kind of working towards this problem and applying it to various different types of data. But we're also quite fortunate to have a collaboration with the Natural History Museum here in London, and that's through my third supervisor, Neil Brummett. And Neil is a botanist who works on the Sampled Red List Index for plants. And Sampled Red List Index, or Red List Index in general, if you haven't come across it before, looks a bit like this. And basically, it's a way of categorizing species into how threatened or endangered we think they are. So obviously, one end of the spectrum is really bad, you're just extinct, and it goes right the way through to those of least concern. But really, the species we're interested in right now are the ones that fall within this middle category, or they're known as threatened. So you kind of jump onto this system as vulnerable, and then as your situation gets worse as a species, you move through to endangered and then critically endangered, where you're really in danger of going extinct if there's no intervention. And so for plants, what they tend to do is select a sample of plant species from every major group to get an idea of roughly how threatened they are. And the statistics so far is that about 20% of those that they've assessed are threatened with extinction. But even more worryingly, there are about 30% of plants that are data deficient, so we don't have enough information to classify them. But because they are data deficient, we probably expect that they're quite rare, and they probably fall within this area that we want to be concerned about. So there's lots of questions that arise from data like this. From the kind of CBD point of view that I was mentioning earlier, if we were to look at the rate of loss of the biodiversity of these plants, can we calculate that? Is it getting worse? From Neil's point of view, he wants to know if he's got limited data, can he still tell whether things are threatened, and whether the patterns that he sees in the plants are true reflections of what's going on in the real world. So for that, we need some pretty good measures, which we're kind of trying to work on. But there was a paper last year, I think it was, that kind of identified these properties for if we wanted to look at biodiversity and how it's changing over time. So we don't want to know that all of the biodiversity is gone when it's gone. We want some kind of advance warning of that. We want measures that are going to be consistent and pick out real trends from the kind of random fluctuations you tend to get in real life systems. So one thing that you think you might want to do is probably just look at the data as it is right now. But the problem with that is that although we've got this global outlook, the data itself, so here I've kind of plotted the last few decades or so of plant data that's available. And what you can see is that parts of Europe come out quite strongly. You can see Australia down there and bits of America. But there are whole swathes of regions that are very underrepresented in terms of the data that's available. And that's not because plants aren't there, it's just they're not being catalogued. So one way that we might want to approach a problem like this is to create our own kind of virtual ecosystem in which we can start to ask some of these questions, and we know everything. So what we can do is we can draw on the kind of data that's available to create a realistic system and start to fill in some of the gaps in the data and really put these diversity measures through their paces. You know, are they any good at detecting change? So for a simulation like this, there are a bunch of different ingredients from the data that we'll want to go in, and I'm going to run through them one by one, the kind of three main ones that I've used Julia to access and really look at. So the first is GBIF. If you haven't heard of GBIF before, it's an online repository of observations of when and where a species was found, where it was recorded, and lots of other pieces of information. So that's where that map came from. And when we looked on GBIF for plants, we found around about 170 million observations that actually have the right kind of geographical coordinates we need to use them. So this is about 220,000 species, which is quite a lot of data. But if we were going to put them into a model, we wanted to know exactly how they were going to behave and respond in their environment. So we had a little look online to see if there was any information about this in kind of pre-existing databases, and only roughly 0.5% or probably less had any kind of information like this, and it tended to be categorical things like tropical places or alpine, so not really that much use to us for a model like this. But happily, we went to JuliaCon last year and we met Devin Kilminster, and he suggested that we should look at this resource, which is the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasting. And among other things, it has this huge online repository of climate reconstructions for the whole world since 1900. It has 3 hourly snapshots of hundreds of different parameters on different surface and pressure levels. It's a really rich resource. And so then we have information on where the plants were found. We've got information on what the climate was like, when and where they were found. And we can start to use and combine this information together to build profiles of what climates the plants actually like. So in terms of Julia, at least for GBIF, we relied quite heavily on JuliaDB, which we also learned about last year. And we had this huge, over 100 gigabyte CSV file of all of the observations of plants ever. So we broke this down into thousands of smaller CSVs, and we were able to load them with JuliaDB and save them in this distributed chunked format. So now we can load it on an order of minutes as opposed to hours originally. And then for the climate data itself, we were using JuliaGeo and some of the packages they have there, like GDAL, ArchGDAL, NetCDF for different formats of climate data. So now we've kind of got a whole bunch of climate data for a 100-year period of the Earth every month, which is quite exciting. So if you were to combine these two pieces of information together and look at it, it might look something a bit like this. So this map I just stole off GBIF of this particular species of moss, and I chose it because it's quite widespread, so you can see that these are the observations, and the kind of deeper red is where there were more of them. And when we look at something like, say, the average temperature it was found at and kind of bin that, what you see is, although it's got quite a broad range of temperatures that it's found in, it is quite a narrow kind of preference here. So there are lots of interesting things that we can draw out of information like this, and there's still a lot of kind of going through the data that we need to do. And then the final ingredient is thinking about the evolutionary relationships between these plants. And I talked about similarity earlier, and this plays heavily into that. So we were quite fortunate that a couple of years ago there was published a huge super tree of about 30,000 plants, which was the largest so far. And actually, for quite a big proportion of that, we had GBIF information and therefore climate preference information now. And so I won't dwell on this too much, but we're hoping that we can use the evolutionary relationships between the species to be able to fill in gaps for those that we have less information for. And for the purposes of this, we built 2 packages, and when I say we, I mean my supervisor, Richard Reeve. So one of them is the diversity package, which is quite specific to the framework of diversity that we're working on, and is a counterpart of an R package that already exists. And it's really what my virtual ecosystems are built upon, and it allows me to easily calculate biodiversity for those systems and bring in information like phylogenetics. And then the phyllo was just kind of a side issue that we couldn't quite find all of the functionality we needed from existing packages, and we needed something that would slot in quite neatly with the diversity and the simulation code, so that's kind of there for now. So then we get to kind of my master plan, I suppose. So I've talked through kind of this part about blending these pieces of information to infer the climate preferences for all of these species. And then we're kind of hoping to move on to feed all of this data into our simulation models and then really start to ask the kind of questions that we're interested in. So if we have poor sampling, can we still pick up anything from these biodiversity measures? So I'd say I've got about this far, which is good because I've only got just over a year left of my PhD. So I've kind of talked a bit about this part, but I want to move into the simulations themselves and how we've kind of progressed them. So just about a year ago after JuliaCon, this is how my simulations looked. So they were really simple, like a 20 by 20 grid. And I had a bunch of, I think, 30 species in there that had kind of a temperature preference, and we just slowly increased the temperature on them over time to see what would happen. And you can see they sort of start to die out and move towards the cooler parts of the system that they're happier with. But this was really slow, partially because the code wasn't written very well by me. So we've done quite a bit of work trying to get this more complicated and nicer to look at. So now we've got to the point, I think we worked out we had about a 10,000 times speed up or something, where we can simulate, when you know how slow it was initially, maybe that's not so impressive. But now we can kind of look at these whole regions of the Earth and simulate for various climate parameters. So in this simulation, if I set it off running, because it takes a little while, what you can see is the species depend on kind of a tolerance for rainfall and temperature, and they draw their resources from the sun because they're plants. So it's running a little bit fast, but this is the alpha diversity. So I talked about the kind of local diversity of those patches. And what you really see here is that there's a cluster here in Europe because we kind of started the simulations based on the GBIF data we had. So a lot of that was found in Europe. And it's a little bit difficult to tell, but there are patches sort of starting to appear across Asia too. And that's going to finish in a second. Okay. But I also talked about various different aspects of biodiversity that we could look at. So alternatively, rather than looking at just the diversity in the patch, we could look at how different it is from the surrounding area. So we can do something like this. And what you see is that actually Europe doesn't kind of show up so much, and there's more kind of patches across the rest of Asia that we see more strongly. And this kind of tells us that there are areas here with different amounts of species or different species themselves. And if we kind of look over time at the number of distinct ecosystems we think we have in the system, it has a real pulse at the start as everything is like moving towards kind of colonizing new areas, and then drops off as parts start to get more and more similar. And then the final one that I talked about is this idea of contribution, so a kind of combination of the diversity and the distinctiveness of the patch. So now what we can see is, yes, Europe comes out quite strongly, but then there's also areas in the rest of Asia that are being picked up. And if we look at this overall, it gives us a rough idea of the number of species in the system. So what you can see is we started out quite high, and this dropped down and kind of has come to an equilibrium around the number of species it can support. So there's a lot of ways that this needs to change. Essentially, we've got all of this data, and for those simulations, I only had about 100 species in. But we've got thousands of the ones that we have information for. We want to do this over broader areas and for finer grid scales. And for that, I really need more speed. And there are kind of two parts of this that I would like to work on. One in particular is parallelizing things properly. So not being kind of a native programmer, I find this concept a bit difficult, but not just having individual simulations running on cores and lots of them at once, but maybe parallelizing across the grid cells so that they're updating at the same time. And then really working on debugging, and it's nice to see that there are lots of tools for this that have been mentioned at this conference. Because there are certainly areas where the simulation is allocating memory it shouldn't, and it's getting the type inferences wrong. So working out how to delve into that will be next steps. And then for the eagle-eyed amongst you, you might have noticed that I plotted all of that in R and not Julia. But I also have kind of learnt that there are lots of ways the Julia plots are expanding. So I hope to kind of change this in the near future. So I mentioned a couple of the packages it would have been really difficult to do this without. So JuliaDB, and we went back and forth with Shashi online quite a lot, trying to get that to work, and it's really successful. JuliaGeo2, axis arrays and unitful combined together has been kind of a godsend for us, because keeping track of all of these different climates with all of their different units, it makes that really easy to do. And then for me in particular, RCall has been a big help in making this transition across between languages, and that's kind of like a really, really rich system. Obviously, it's quite a specific problem, so there was a lot of stuff that we needed to build ourselves, but I think it's really exciting to see these Julia ecosystems coming together. And hopefully things like the subject-specific ones like ecojulia, JuliaGeo, and BioJulia kind of all come together and work across ecosystems for problems like this. And I should mention that they're coming up next. We've made a lot of ground with the simulations themselves, but there's a lot more that I need to do. And if people have suggestions about good tricks for getting things to run faster, to be able to incorporate more data and more species, then we would certainly be appreciative. Switching over to Julia, from my perspective, hasn't always been easy for someone who's not really trained in programming, but it was really well worth making the switch. I was quite fortunate that my supervisor is quite experienced in programming, so he kind of helped me navigate getting used to the type system and multiple dispatch and all of that kind of thing. And I think it's made my code a lot stronger and definitely a lot more readable than it used to be. So that's really nice. And then, so hopefully in the future we'll see a lot more tools for life scientists, because I think this is like a really good resource, and I can think of many people in my department alone that could benefit from using Julia in their analyses. So I think that's pretty much it for me, but thank you for listening. If you've got any questions, feel free, but otherwise come and ask me anything later.
Great. Thank you, Claire. Questions then?
So I'm thinking when you're measuring biodiversity, and you're talking that you can measure like how many species you have, how different they are, how much do I count? You think like how much of every species I have, like so if just not counting the species but like the size of the populations.
Yeah. So obviously with the kind of diversity framework, I didn't really go into that much. It kind of depends on the system that you're looking at, but normally you would put, say, the abundance in, and there's another parameter that you can kind of fine-tune about how much you care about abundance. So you could look at it from the point of view like, I really care exactly about how many species there are, or I care more about the really abundant ones. So there's kind of a range, but if you want to look at the paper or talk more about it, then we could definitely do that.
I imagine there must be quite a lot room for your own, like if you have this several different things, and how you actually want to weight them around. So there could be quite a lot of wiggle room to how you want to.
Yeah, definitely. It can be quite an art form, and that's why the whole concept of measuring biodiversity isn't easy, because it kind of depends on what you want to do as well. So yeah, definitely.
I've actually got 3 questions, but I won't ask them all because I know there are others who want to ask. I'll
Okay.
come and talk to you later. But the main one I wanted to ask was, so when you showed kind of your models, and you showed how it's sort of spreading across the sort of like Asian, Russian region.
Yeah.
Is that spread something that you sort of account for? Like you have models for how plant species are spreading, or is that driven by the climate? Or
So yeah, in my models, it's mainly driven by like I seed the ecosystem based on where they're found in GBIF initially, but because it's so biased, that's also something we need to work on. And then they spread out according to how many resources. So in this case, like the sunlight, and we also want to incorporate like water sources. It's important for plants. But they then spread out into areas, but their survivability in that area depends upon the climate, so like temperature and rainfall at the moment, and then we want to kind of work in more different aspects of climate to that.
yeah, great, thanks.
So one of the things that we've been talking about at this conference, especially with Mike over here, we've been talking about how we should be restructuring the plotting libraries to be able to better help the people throughout that are using Julia.
Yeah.
And you seem to have a lot of really great visualizations here, and you're saying that you want to really make use of Julia.
Yeah.
I really want to find out what are the specific pain points, and what kind of things do you think the plotting libraries would need to have to really accommodate the types of visualizations you need for your research?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, my knowledge of plotting in Julia is quite limited, which is probably why I use R quite a bit. But from my point of view, it would be nice to be able to kind of plot these like long-term animations like in Julia. At the moment, I'm like feeding them into R, plotting them out, and then turning that into a video. So making that process like easier to do, which might already exist in Julia. I just kind of haven't.
If you use the Julia types,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
get that plotting for free.
That's actually something that I forgot to mention, is that we're hoping to incorporate the kind of eco-Julia way of doing things. So hopefully that will improve things a lot. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right. Well, let's thank our speaker again. Then.
Thank you.